Fyodor Dostoevsky, the Russian literary giant, explored the complexities of the human soul like few others, and no aspect of human nature was more central to his exploration than love. For Dostoevsky, love was not merely an uplifting or joyful emotion. It was a force of profound complexity that could never be separated from pain and suffering. The paradox of love, as Dostoevsky saw it, was that it could elevate the soul, bring profound moments of happiness, and yet, at the same time, bring torment, agony, and even destruction. In his works, love was never one-dimensional. It was always fraught with tension, with emotional conflict, and, above all, with suffering. To understand why Dostoevsky viewed love as always painful, one must first grasp the depth of his understanding of human nature. For him, love was not an idealized, serene emotion that transcends all suffering. Instead, it was something deeply embedded in the human condition, something that could not be fully realized without bringing the individual face to face with their own deepest fears, desires, and contradictions. Love, in Dostoevsky's world, was both a path to redemption and a source of damnation. From Crime and Punishment to the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's characters are often caught in the throes of love that forces them to confront their own darkness, to make terrible sacrifices, and to face the consequences of their actions. The painful love they experience is not merely a plot device. It is a reflection of the internal moral and spiritual struggles that Dostoevsky believed were the true essence of the human soul. At the heart of Dostoevsky's view on love is the idea that it is not something that can be easily tamed or controlled. Love is not a peaceful, serene emotion that flows freely between individuals. Rather, it is a powerful, often destructive force that reveals the true nature of those who experience it. For Dostoevsky, love's pain was inseparable from its transformative power. To truly love was to be willing to endure suffering, sometimes self-inflicted, sometimes brought about by others, and often a consequence of the very nature of human existence itself. Through his deeply philosophical and psychologically complex characters, Dostoevsky presents a vision of love that is not about idealized connection or romantic bliss. Instead, love is about the deep, painful work of self-discovery, of grappling with one's flaws, desires, and shortcomings, and of enduring the suffering that inevitably accompanies such an awakening. To love is to expose oneself to vulnerability, to risk the collapse of one's self-constructed identity, and to endure the agony of becoming something greater, yet painfully fractured in the process. For Dostoevsky, love is not just a source of happiness, it is a necessary force that pushes individuals toward their limits, demanding the most profound spiritual and moral challenges. It is through the agony of love that his characters find themselves, even if that self-discovery is, at times, a path filled with deep sorrow, guilt, and moral conflict. The love Dostoevsky describes is transformative, but not in the gentle, uplifting sense we often expect. It is a love that tears down the walls of the ego, exposes the deepest fears and longings, and demands a sacrifice that goes far beyond what most are willing to offer. This paradox that love is both the greatest blessing and the greatest curse runs through all of Dostoevsky's works. His characters, often tragic, find themselves torn between the ecstasy of love and its inevitable suffering. This conflict is not something that Dostoevsky saw as avoidable or escapable. For him, it was an essential aspect of the human condition. Love, in its truest sense, could not exist without pain. It was through pain that love revealed its deepest power and its greatest lessons. Dostoevsky's portrayal of love is not merely literary or philosophical, it is deeply spiritual. It reflects his understanding of human nature as inherently flawed, struggling to reconcile the divine and the demonic within. Love, in this context, is the battleground where these forces clash, where self-sacrifice, egoism, and deep-seated desires come to the surface. The painful love Dostoevsky writes about is not only a reflection of the character's internal struggles, but a larger reflection of the human condition itself. It is through this lens that we begin to understand why, for Dostoevsky, love is always painful. In the world Dostoevsky crafts for his readers, love is not an idyllic escape or an effortless connection between souls. Rather, it is a complex, often painful force that is deeply embedded in the human condition. Love is the crucible in which the soul is both tested and refined, and it is within love's suffering that the true nature of human existence is revealed. For Dostoevsky, love is always painful because it is bound to the very essence of what it means to be human, a being torn between good and evil, divine aspiration and base desires, selflessness and egoism. In the novels of Dostoevsky, characters who experience the most profound love also experience the greatest suffering. This is a recurring theme that runs through Crime and Punishment, the Brothers Karamazov, and Demons. For Raskolnikov, the protagonist of Crime and Punishment, love is a distant concept, something he views with skepticism and moral detachment. Yet it is through his relationship with Sonia, a woman he views as both a sinner and a saint, that he is forced to confront his own guilt, ego, and desire for redemption. Sonia's love is both a source of his torment and his salvation. Her love forces Raskolnikov to recognize his own suffering, to admit his crimes, and to eventually seek redemption. The pain of love in Crime and Punishment is not just emotional, it is a moral and spiritual reckoning that cannot be avoided. Raskolnikov's suffering is not a consequence of his love for Sonia alone. It is a direct result of the internal conflict that love awakens in him. Love, in Dostoevsky's view, exposes the deep fissures within the human soul, the conflict between what we desire and what we believe we deserve, between self-interest and self-sacrifice, between sin and grace. Love forces individuals to confront these contradictions head-on, and this confrontation is often painful. It is not the love itself that is painful, but the way love magnifies the flaws, the fears, and the unresolved conflicts of the self. This theme of love as a catalyst for suffering is further explored in the Brothers Karamazov. Dmitri Karamazov's love for Grushenka is a love that brings him both ecstatic joy and intense torment. His love for her represents his moral and spiritual struggle, his inability to reconcile his deepest desires with his aspirations for higher moral ground. Dmitri's love, like Raskolnikov's, becomes a battleground where his spiritual evolution is tested by his own lust, egoism, and violent tendencies. As Dmitri struggles with his feelings for Grushenka, he is driven to madness, to violent outbursts, and, ultimately, to a path that threatens to destroy him. Yet, in this agony, Dmitri finds the possibility of redemption, the possibility of spiritual awakening, but only through suffering. In this light, love becomes not only painful, but essential for personal transformation. It is through suffering that Dmitri and other Dostoevsky characters are forced to confront their deepest flaws and their higher potential. For Dostoevsky, love's pain is not accidental. It is a necessary part of the human experience. It is the price we must pay for connecting with another soul. To love deeply is to expose ourselves to the full range of human emotions: joy, sorrow, passion, jealousy, and fear. To truly love is to take on the pain of the other, to face the anguish that inevitably arises when two souls intertwine and become inseparable. It is a surrender to the complexity of the human heart, a surrender that requires both vulnerability and strength. Love's suffering, in Dostoevsky's works, also reveals the core of his existential beliefs. Human beings, according to Dostoevsky, are not purely good or purely evil. They are beings caught in a constant struggle between light and dark, between the divine and the demonic. In this struggle, love plays a pivotal role. It is through love that individuals encounter the deepest aspects of their nature, both the noble and the corrupt. Love opens up a space where these forces can collide, where the soul can either be uplifted or destroyed. The pain of love, then, is not just emotional, it is a spiritual awakening, a confrontation with the reality of our existence. Love is not about finding a perfect partner or experiencing eternal bliss. It is about engaging with the fullness of human experience, with all of its beauty and pain, its light and darkness. It is through this engagement that the individual is forced to confront the reality of who they are. In this way, love becomes a mirror, reflecting not only the idealized version of ourselves that we hope to project, but also the unvarnished truth of who we really are. To love is to open oneself to both the joy of connection and the sorrow of vulnerability. For Dostoevsky, love is never one-sided, never a simple, clean emotion. It is both the highest bliss and the deepest despair, intertwined in a way that cannot be separated. The experience of love in his works is a volatile force, a tempest that sweeps through the characters, leaving them both elated and broken. Love does not merely uplift, it often shatters, breaks, and destroys. It is a paradox capable of giving both uncontainable joy and unbearable pain. In Dostoevsky's world, the experience of love is always volatile. It is never serene or calm. Instead, it carries with it an intensity that can overwhelm the soul. Characters like Raskolnikov, Dmitri Karamazov, and Prince Mishkin are subject to love's extraordinary power, which becomes the source of both their greatest highs and their deepest lows. It is not that love simply exists in a state of discomfort. It is that the discomfort of love is so often mixed with its ecstasy. To love, for Dostoevsky, is to embrace both extremes, to live on the precipice of overwhelming passion and profound suffering. Take, for example, the character of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. His love for Sonia is not a love that brings him peace or comfort. In fact, it is a love that seems to exacerbate his suffering, dragging him further into his moral and existential conflict. Yet, this same love is the catalyst for his eventual redemption. Sonia's love is both a balm and a burden, a source of solace and a cause of agony. For Raskolnikov, Sonia's love becomes a reflection of his guilt and a mirror to his soul, showing him the depths of his suffering while offering him the possibility of salvation. This duality, the love that tortures and the love that heals, is central to Dostoevsky's conception of what it means to love. In the Brothers Karamazov, the theme of love's duality is taken even further. Dmitri Karamazov's love for Grushenka is a love that sweeps him into ecstasy, but it also drives him to madness, jealousy, and destruction. Dmitri is consumed by his emotions, torn between a higher spiritual love and a more base, sensual desire. His love for Grushenka is both a path to redemption and a journey into self-destruction. In this, Dostoevsky is showing that love is not a linear force. It is a tempest that can both uplift and tear apart. Dmitri's struggle is the perfect reflection of love's inherent contradiction. It is both the source of his joy and his torment. The duality of love is also illustrated through Prince Mishkin in The Idiot. Mishkin's love for Nastasia is marked by purity and intensity. but it is also a love that causes him deep suffering. Nastasia's love for Mishkin, while pure in its own way, also reflects her own self-destructive tendencies. In The Idiot, love is a force that leads to self-sacrifice, but it also leads to tragedy. Mishkin's intense love, despite his best intentions, cannot save Nastasia, nor can it bring him peace. The pain of love in this novel is not merely external, but deeply internal, as Mishkin's idealism is shattered by the very people he loves. Dostoevsky's characters do not experience love as something that fits neatly into categories of good or bad. Love is not simply a pleasurable connection between people. It is an intense emotional journey, fraught with moments of elation and despair. His exploration of love reveals its complexity, how it pushes his characters to the brink of madness, how it can both destroy and redeem, how it can elevate the soul while simultaneously causing it to collapse. This is the essence of Dostoevsky's conception of love. It is an experience that demands everything, but gives everything in return, even if that return is not always in the form one expects. To love is to experience the full range of human emotion. Love in Dostoevsky's world cannot exist without its opposite. Its joy cannot exist without its pain. Its ecstasy cannot exist without its agony. His characters are pulled into the emotional extremes of life, unable to avoid the suffering that love inevitably brings, but also unable to resist the moments of joy that accompany it. The contradiction of love's duality is a central theme in Dostoevsky's philosophy. To truly love, he suggests, is to understand that the pleasure of connection cannot be separated from the pain of vulnerability. Love's capacity to bring both beauty and torment is what makes it so powerful and so dangerous. This duality is also reflected in Dostoevsky's understanding of the human soul. For him, human beings are not simply creatures of good or evil. They are a complex amalgamation of both. Love, in this context, becomes a force that mirrors this complexity. It exposes the contradictions within us, forcing us to confront both the divine and the demonic aspects of our nature. Love reveals our deepest desires and darkest fears, and it is this revelation that makes love so painful. In Dostoevsky's works, love is never a simple or superficial emotion. It is not something that can be reduced to a mere feeling of affection or tenderness. It is something far more profound, something that goes beyond the surface to reveal the deepest, most hidden parts of the soul. Love, for Dostoevsky, is a mirror that forces individuals to confront the truth of who they are, both the beauty and the darkness that resides within them. It is through the experience of love that characters are often forced to face themselves, to confront their deepest flaws, desires, and contradictions. In love, there is no escape from the truth. The experience of love in Dostoevsky's novels is not one of idealization or romance. Instead, it is a deeply uncomfortable confrontation with the self. To love, in Dostoevsky's world, is to be exposed, to be laid bare in front of another person and, by extension, in front of oneself. The act of loving is the act of revealing all that is hidden inside, the good and the bad, the noble and the corrupt. Through love, Dostoevsky's characters are forced to see their own soul in its entirety, unflinching and unvarnished. Raskolnikov's relationship with Sonia in Crime and Punishment is a perfect example of how love acts as a mirror to the soul. Raskolnikov, consumed by guilt and pride, initially rejects Sonia's love, unable to accept the truth of his own actions. But as Sonia's love for him deepens, so too does Raskolnikov's awareness of his own moral failings. Sonia's love, in a sense, forces him to confront his own sin and guilt, and through this confrontation, he begins the painful process of self-discovery and redemption. The love that Sonia offers is not easy or comforting. It is a love that exposes Raskolnikov's weaknesses, his pride, and his fear of facing the truth. But it is this very exposure, this act of being laid bare, that allows Raskolnikov to begin his journey toward redemption. Dostoevsky's characters often find themselves in similar situations. They fall in love not to be comforted, but to be forced to reckon with the darkest parts of themselves. The very act of loving becomes an act of revelation, an unmasking of the self. This revelation is painful because it exposes all the parts of the soul that people often try to suppress or ignore. In love, there is no place to hide. Love, in Dostoevsky's world, is the ultimate test of one's character, for it forces the individual to confront their own ego, their own desires, and their own capacity for good and evil. In the Brothers Karamazov, Alyosha's love for his family, particularly his troubled father and brothers, is both a source of his strength and his suffering. Alyosha is the idealist, the one who believes in the possibility of redemption, in the possibility of spiritual salvation through love. However, his love for his father and brothers forces him to face the depths of human depravity, the lies and moral failings of those he holds dear. Alyosha's love is not one of blind adoration. It is a love that challenges him to see his family members for who they truly are, with all their flaws and contradictions. Through his love, Alyosha is forced to confront the darkness in those around him, but also the darkness within himself. The pain of love, in this case, is not simply the suffering caused by others' flaws, but the recognition that even in the most idealistic forms of love, there is always the potential for betrayal, for moral failure, for the realization that we are all, at times, deeply flawed. This theme of love as a mirror to the soul is also present in The Idiot. Prince Mishkin's love for Nastasia is a love that reveals her deepest insecurities, her self-destructive tendencies, and the profound emotional scars that she carries. However, it is also a love that forces Mishkin to confront his own naivety, his idealism, and his inability to navigate the complexities of the human heart. Mishkin's love for Nastasia is not an easy, serene experience. It is a love that exposes both the purity and the limitations of his character. In loving her, Mishkin is forced to see his own vulnerability, his own capacity for self-deception, and the painful truth that even the most noble love cannot always save others or ourselves. For Dostoevsky, love is never a perfect or idealized connection between two people. It is a force that reveals the raw truth of human nature, the truth that we often try to hide from ourselves and others. In loving, we expose ourselves, and in this exposure, we often discover parts of ourselves that we would rather not face. Love is the great revealer, the force that strips away the masks and illusions we create and leaves us with the unvarnished truth of who we are. It is through this painful revelation that we are given the opportunity to grow, to evolve, and to face the darkness within us with courage and humility. In the world Dostoevsky creates, love is never purely self-serving. It is always bound up with sacrifice, not just the sacrifice of material possessions or time, but the sacrifice of the self. In his novels, characters are often asked to give up their own desires, their own ambitions, and even their own sense of identity for the sake of the ones they love. This sacrifice is not always voluntary, nor is it always noble. It often comes with a great deal of pain, inner turmoil, and personal cost. But it is through this sacrifice, this giving of oneself, that love in Dostoevsky's world reveals its true nature. Sacrifice for Dostoevsky is not just a moral or religious ideal, it is a necessity of love. To love is to be willing to lose something of yourself, to step outside of your own ego and desires, and to give of yourself in a way that demands profound vulnerability and selflessness. Love, in this sense, is not about self-gratification or fulfilling one's own needs. It is about transcendence, about the ability to place another person's needs above your own and to sacrifice your own happiness for theirs. This theme of sacrificial love is most clearly illustrated in Crime and Punishment, where Sonia's love for Raskolnikov is not just a source of emotional support for him, but a complete giving of herself. Sonia is a prostitute, a woman who has suffered immensely in life, yet her love for Raskolnikov is pure and selfless. She offers him not only her love, but also her own spiritual strength, constantly seeking to bring him back from the edge of moral and psychological ruin. Sonia sacrifices her own dignity and happiness for Raskolnikov's sake, willing to bear his sins and pain as her own in the hope of redeeming him. Her love for him is not just an emotional attachment. It is an act of profound personal sacrifice, a sacrifice that brings her suffering, but also gives her a deep sense of purpose. Sonia's ability to love Raskolnikov in this way is both a testament to the depth of her character and a reflection of Dostoevsky's view of love as an act of spiritual giving. Raskolnikov's relationship with Sonia is a complex one, and it is through Sonia's self-sacrifice that he is eventually forced to confront his own guilt and spiritual emptiness. It is not only Sonia who sacrifices for Raskolnikov, but Raskolnikov himself, who must ultimately sacrifice his own pride, ego, and sense of superiority to face the consequences of his crime. His journey toward redemption is marked by this internal sacrifice, the surrendering of his own intellectual arrogance and isolation in exchange for the emotional and spiritual healing that love offers. In the Brothers Karamazov, the character of Alyosha is also a figure of sacrificial love. Alyosha's love is not just a romantic attachment, but a love for humanity itself, for his family, and for God. He is willing to sacrifice his own personal desires and aspirations in order to serve others and to guide them towards spiritual enlightenment. Alyosha's devotion to his father and his brothers, despite their flaws and moral failings, is an expression of this sacrificial love. He gives of himself freely, not for personal gain or recognition, but because he believes that love is the highest form of human connection, one that transcends selfishness and self-interest. For Alyosha, sacrifice is not a mere duty, it is the natural consequence of true love. To love is to give of oneself without expecting anything in return, to invest emotionally and spiritually in others without regard for personal reward. Alyosha's willingness to embrace this kind of love, despite the suffering it brings him, reflects Dostoevsky's belief that true love always requires sacrifice. It is through sacrifice that love becomes purer, more profound, and more capable of transforming the human soul. Yet, Dostoevsky is not idealistic in his portrayal of sacrificial love. He does not present it as a simple or easy choice. The sacrifice involved in love is often deeply painful and filled with moral ambiguity. In The Idiot, Prince Mishkin's love for Nastasha and Aglaya is marked by a kind of self-sacrifice, but it is also fraught with confusion and emotional turmoil. Mishkin's love is not always returned in the way he hopes, and his idealism often leads to disappointment and despair. In his attempts to save others, Mishkin sacrifices his own happiness and peace of mind. His love, in this sense, becomes a burden, one that he must carry alone. Dostoevsky's exploration of love often presents a deep and enduring paradox. Love, the greatest force capable of offering redemption, is also inseparably linked to pain. This paradox lies at the heart of Dostoevsky's most famous works, where the experience of love is both the highest moral calling and the source of the greatest suffering. Love is not a gentle, idealized force that brings only peace and happiness. Instead, it is a storm that sweeps through the soul, leaving destruction in its wake. And yet, this destruction is necessary for true redemption. Through the agony of love, the characters in Dostoevsky's works are given the chance to transcend their base instincts, confront their deepest moral flaws, and ultimately experience spiritual renewal. The concept of love as a pathway to redemption through pain is embodied most clearly in Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov's journey is one of torment and suffering, both brought about and alleviated by love. His capacity for love is at first suppressed, twisted by his pride and intellectual arrogance, but it is through Sonia's love, pure, selfless, and unflinching, that Raskolnikov's redemption begins. Sonia's love does not come without great cost. It requires her to endure his rejection, his guilt, and his ego, but it is through her love that Raskolnikov is finally able to face the weight of his crime. The pain he experiences, both through his isolation and through Sonia's self-sacrificial love, acts as a catalyst for his moral awakening. Through love's suffering, Raskolnikov finds the courage to confront his sins and seek redemption. In Dostoevsky's world, love's pain is inseparable from its power to redeem. This theme of redemption through love's pain is also evident in the Brothers Karamazov. Dmitry Karamazov's love for Grushenka is a love that drives him to madness, jealousy, and self-doubt. His love is intense, passionate, and all-consuming, but it also brings out the worst in him. Yet it is through this turbulent love that Dmitry is forced to confront the darker parts of his soul, his pride, his impulsiveness, and his tendency toward violence. Dmitry's journey toward redemption is not a peaceful one. It is marked by emotional outbursts, self-destructive behavior, and moral confusion. But in the end, his suffering is transformative. Through the pain of love, Dmitry gains clarity about his true nature, and in this realization, he experiences a form of spiritual awakening. Dostoevsky's depiction of love as a source of redemption through pain is not only a moral or emotional process, but a deeply spiritual one. In his view, the human soul can only transcend its flaws, its sins, and its suffering through the transformative power of love. However, this transcendence is not easy. It comes at a great cost. The soul must be shattered before it can be healed. The individual must experience suffering before they can achieve the clarity and spiritual insight necessary for redemption. For Dostoevsky, this is not a flaw of love, but its greatest strength. It is only through the agony of love that the soul is truly purified. One of the key elements of this paradox is the idea that love's pain is not simply something to be endured, it is something that must be embraced. The characters who are able to transcend their suffering and experience redemption are those who allow themselves to feel love's pain deeply. In The Idiot, Prince Mishkin's love for Nastasia is another example of how love leads to spiritual redemption through agony. Mishkin's love is pure and untainted by self-interest, but it is also a love that exposes the depths of Nastasia's suffering. In the process, Mishkin is forced to confront his own idealism and naivety. His journey is marked by personal sacrifice, and although his love for Nastasia does not save her from her destructive fate, it leads to his own spiritual growth. Mishkin's experience demonstrates that love, though painful, can lead to a deeper understanding of the self and the world. His suffering becomes a path to a kind of spiritual clarity that transcends the purely emotional or intellectual. This paradox of love's painful redemption is perhaps best understood in the context of Dostoevsky's broader philosophical and religious views. Dostoevsky believed that suffering was an inevitable part of the human experience, and that it was through suffering that individuals could find their way to spiritual enlightenment. This is not to say that suffering itself is virtuous, but rather that suffering, when embraced and understood, can lead to moral and spiritual growth. Love, for Dostoevsky, is the force that drives this process of self-awareness and transformation. It is only by experiencing the pain of love that one is able to achieve redemption, to rise above the ego and its desires, and to achieve spiritual purity. In Dostoevsky's world, love is a spiritual force that does not shy away from the rawest depths of human suffering. Love's pain, in his view, is not merely an unfortunate consequence of human connection. It is a critical and even sacred element of the human experience. For Dostoevsky, suffering and love are inseparable. Love's pain is not just an emotion to endure. It is the vehicle through which individuals are spiritually tested, cleansed, and ultimately transformed. It is through the deepest agony that the soul is refined and awakened to a higher level of existence, and in this sense, love becomes the most potent force for spiritual growth. Dostoevsky's characters are often tested through the pain of love. This is particularly evident in the Brothers Karamazov, where the characters' experiences with love are profoundly tied to their spiritual journeys. Alyosha, the novel's spiritual idealist, is able to endure his suffering because he sees it not as punishment, but as part of a divine plan. His love for his family, particularly for his father, who is a deeply flawed and morally compromised man, is a love that demands sacrifice. Alyosha's suffering becomes a pathway to understanding the deeper truths of existence. His spiritual growth is not a result of serene contemplation or intellectual study, but through the intense, often painful experiences that love brings into his life. Similarly, Dmitry Karamazov's journey toward redemption is inextricably linked to the suffering caused by his passionate love for Grushenka. Dmitry's love for her is far from idealized. It is marked by jealousy, rage, and emotional turmoil. Yet this very pain leads Dmitry to confront his own moral failings and to make the painful decision to accept responsibility for his actions. Through his suffering, Dmitry experiences a form of spiritual awakening, not because his love for Grushenka is perfect, but because it forces him to confront the chaos within himself and ultimately find a sense of humility and grace. Dmitry's pain is not just an emotional experience, it is a spiritual crucible that shapes him into a more self-aware and morally grounded individual. Dostoevsky's portrayal of love's pain is not intended to suggest that suffering is inherently virtuous. Rather, it is a necessary part of the human condition. The pain that love brings is a reflection of the imperfections of the world and of human nature itself. In Dostoevsky's view, the human soul is inherently flawed, torn between the divine and the demonic, and it is through suffering, particularly the suffering caused by love, that the soul can be purified. Love's pain is a reminder of the fundamental flaws in human nature, but it is also the force that can lead to redemption and self-understanding. The suffering that love causes is also linked to Dostoevsky's Christian existentialism. For Dostoevsky, suffering is not a meaningless affliction, it is a path to redemption. The pain of love is not just a punishment, it is a means through which individuals are brought closer to God. By enduring the suffering that love brings, individuals are forced to reckon with their own flaws, their own sins, and their own need for spiritual transformation. In this sense, love's pain is an essential part of the journey towards spiritual awakening. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov's suffering is directly tied to his inability to accept love. At the beginning of the novel, Raskolnikov rejects Sonia's love, believing that his intellectual superiority makes him unworthy of such a connection. However, It is only when he accepts Sonya's love not just as an emotional connection, but as a force that forces him to confront his own guilt and pride that he begins to experience true redemption. The pain of love in crime and punishment is not just emotional, it is a moral and spiritual reckoning. It is through love's pain that Raskolnikov is forced to face the depth of his sins, and through this confrontation he begins the painful process of spiritual growth. The spiritual significance of love's pain is not just a concept that Dostoevsky explores in his characters, it is also a central tenet of his own religious and philosophical beliefs. Dostoevsky believed that suffering was an inevitable part of the human experience, and that it was through suffering that individuals could attain the highest form of spiritual growth. The pain that love causes is not a tragic accident, it is a means of purifying the soul. In Dostoevsky's view, love is not simply an emotional or physical connection. It is a spiritual journey that requires sacrifice, humility, and acceptance of suffering. Love's pain is the price of this transformation, the cost of becoming more fully aware of one's spiritual potential.